Greetings, Newburg Church. This is Pastor Steve here with our Monday Minute for May the 18th of 2020. We're continuing still in our state of stay home, stay safe for the remainder of this month. So we'll be conducting online worship only during that time. One of the things I want to share with you is that Bishop Bard and the cabinet here in Michigan have released a document that is called a set of principles and directions for the reopening of United Methodist Church facilities in Michigan. Along with that are a series of studies and recommendations that have been made through alliances of other churches, as well as looking at best practices along with the CDC guidelines and also working with state and local officials. Our staff will be reviewing that in these next couple of weeks and coming up with a plan of what reopening might look like here for us at Newburg Church. I do want to warn us that it is not going to be instantaneous and it is not going to look exactly like it did. And in fact, it is going to be a long and slow process as we get back to reopening and some forms of in-person worship here in the future. So look for our response to that. I also want to invite you to join us a week from Tuesday on May the 26th for an online town hall event that will be scheduled for 7 p.m. where I'll have a chance to present what we have so far here at Newburg and a chance to answer anybody's questions that we might have going forward. We're all in this together. This is going to continue to be a process. And of course, our top priority is making sure that everyone is staying home and staying safe here for the foreseeable future. We would not want anyone to be at risk just simply because we are gathering together. Our ultimate goal is to love our neighbor as ourselves, and we will continue to do that. This week in particular, I've been a little fired up about how we are treating one another, but also how we handle those standards. And the thought that came to my mind today was about how we pick and choose which standards are most important to us, especially when we talk about the Christian faith. Now, I've shared before that many people have co-opted the Christian faith and formed it into something that supports their own agenda, rather than supporting what the gospel of Jesus Christ is calling us to do for a transformed world and to bring about God's kingdom here on earth. And yet at the same time, we find ourselves falling into the same trap. The truth is, we all pick and choose what we think best fits our narrative and justifies our position. And when we encounter something else, wow, do things really get thrown for a loop. Sometimes we encounter that and we feel that, well, what we have said and believed just are not justified or truthful anymore. Other times, however, we get defensive and we go looking for other things to justify ourselves. The scriptures, I think, can help us out a little bit in this way, particularly for those of us who are on the side of grace, if you will, versus the side of judgment. And how do we try to balance that out? And in that, again, we find ourselves picking and choosing. But the Apostle Paul says that in Colossians 3, he says, "As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other, just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive." Well, we oftentimes look at that and say, well, no matter what happens, we just have to forgive. And I believe that is true. But what we also cannot count out is what Paul says before that. In verse 8, he says, "But now you must get rid of all such things: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive language from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have stripped off the old self with its practices and have clothed yourselves with which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its creator. In that renewal there is no longer Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian or Scythian," we'll worry about what those are later, "slave and free, but Christ is all and in all. See, when we find ourselves behaving in certain ways and other people call us out for those behaviors, the immediate thing that we want to do is say, "You're picking and choosing," and we want to justify our own actions. But that's not what the Christian faith is all about. The Christian faith is about helping us to understand what God's purpose for us and for God's church in the world is, and then try to model that and to live that out. And when we see people who are not exactly living up to the best model, the scriptures are filled with ways of how Christians are called to deal with it and are actually calling those out. The difficulty can be in how we interpret those, but also which ones we choose. It's easy for some people to jump on the fornication bandwagon when it comes to human sexuality, but when we start talking about greed, we don't want to talk about that. God has given us dominion, if you will, and again, we try to find things to justify ourselves. But the truth is, all of these things are a part of what it means to live in the Christian life. And in particular in these times, where we have seen how we're handling the coronavirus and how it is that our governments have been responding in order to help keep us safe, we've seen that there's a lot more nuance in between, rather than one side or the other. The biggest thing for me is, how are we loving our neighbor as ourselves, which is the greatest commandment that Jesus has given us? How are we taking care of the poor? How are we taking care of the sick? How are we taking care of those who do not have means? Because Jesus reminds us in Matthew that when we do it to those who are the least of these, we are actually taking care of him. And so we must set aside our preferences and even our picking and choosing for the greater good. We all want to reopen probably as fast as we can as we're getting stir crazy. But we also have to remember that it is not about picking and choosing, because we cannot put the detriment of our neighbor under ourselves. Our neighbor must always come first, and how we are loving our neighbor. But also, we must hold one another accountable for how we are treating our neighbor. So this week, as we continue to watch our political dramas unfold, and as we ourselves are taking steps here in Michigan to open back up, let's also remember that as followers of Jesus Christ, we are the ones who are called to not only hold one another accountable, but we are also called to do it with a spirit of love and kindness and compassion and forgiveness. The last question that all of us as pastors, and Reverend Castaway will be asked this too as his upcoming ordination, is about the historic questions of John Wesley. And the last one is, will you keep these rules, not for wrath, but for conscience sake? Our conscience has to be what is driving us. And our conscience, for the love of God and the love of neighbor, is what has driven every decision that we have been making here at Newburg so far. And I pray that all of us together will make those decisions that help us to love one another, to call people to accountability, but also not to do so for wrath, but for the sake and the conscience of everybody else. It's my prayer this week that you will continue to do that, and you'll continue to share in that faith, and that together we'll grow and we will help one another remain accountable, and we will help one another continue to grow in the love of Jesus Christ by keeping everyone healthy and everyone safe. Stay tuned in these next days and weeks. We'll continue to update you, but God bless and have a great week.